So, I've got something super interesting for you today on decoding crypto Pi. We're diving into this absolutely wild story about Pi Network, and it's pretty mind blowing what's been happening.
Oh my goodness. Sarah, you're absolutely right. And this is actually one of the most fascinating developments we've seen in the crypto space, like in recent memory. We're talking about this massive price crash that just happened with Pi Network's coin.
So Brian, I know you've been following this really closely. Could you give us a sense of just how dramatic this crash was?
Well, we're looking at, and this is pretty incredible, like a 62% drop, right? The coin went from, and I remember these numbers specifically, $1.97 all the way down to, just about $0.730, and this happened literally just a day after its listing, which is pretty unprecedented.
Wow, that's a pretty substantial drop. I mean, there must be quite a story behind this.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what's really interesting about this whole situation is that we're not just talking about any regular crypto project here. Like Pi Network has this absolutely massive user base, right? Over 110 million users. And they've got this really unique approach to crypto mining that's totally different from what we usually see.
Um, Before we dive deeper into what happened, could you explain what Pi Network actually is? Like, what makes it so different from other cryptocurrencies?
Oh, absolutely. So, Pi Network is this really fascinating project that, and this is what makes it so interesting, was actually started by some brilliant minds from Stanford University back in 2019. And and what they did was they completely revolutionized how we think about crypto mining.
What do you mean by that? How is it different?
Well, you see, traditional crypto mining, right? Like with Bitcoin, you need these massive, expensive mining rigs that consume like tons of energy. But Pi, and this is what's really genius about it, lets people mine directly from their smartphones. Like, it's literally as simple as opening an app once a day, right? And you're mining cryptocurrency.
Um, that sounds almost too good to be true. How does that even work?
So, and this is really interesting, they designed this system that's super energy efficient. Like, it doesn't drain your battery or anything. And what's really incredible is that they've managed to create this massive community around it. We're talking about, and these numbers are just mind-blowing, over 110 million users worldwide who are all part of this ecosystem,
That's a pretty impressive number of users.
right? And you know what's even more fascinating is that they've built this whole system around community verification and trust networks. Like, they've created this really unique approach where users can boost their mining rates by connecting with other trusted members, which creates this really interesting social aspect to the whole mining process.
So let's talk about what everyone's really curious about. What exactly happened with this huge price crash?
Oh man, this is actually quite fascinating. So when Pi first hit the exchanges, right, it started trading at around 1.97, which was, and this really got people excited, a pretty strong opening. But then, and this is where things get really interesting, we saw this massive drop of like 62% down to about $0.737.
That's a pretty dramatic fall. What caused such a big drop?
So, there are actually several factors at play here, right? And the biggest one, I think, is what we're calling the early miner effect. You see, since 2019, right, there have been millions of people mining Pi on their phones, just accumulating these coins without any real investment. And when the coin finally became tradable, a lot of these early miners just started cashing out.
I guess that makes sense. People wanting to finally see some returns?
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting is that we're seeing this pattern where the sell orders are actually pretty small. Like, we're talking a few hundred Pi coins at most. But, and this is crucial, there's just so many of these small sells happening at once, right? And not enough big buyers coming in to balance it out.
Are there any other factors contributing to this decline?
Oh, absolutely. And this is really important. Pi hasn't managed to get listed on Binance yet, which is like, the biggest crypto exchange in the world. Plus, there's this whole other issue where the network still needs to prove its real-world utility. Like, they've got this massive user base, right? but they're still working on developing actual use cases and applications.
That sounds like it could be a pretty significant challenge moving forward.
Yeah, it really is. But you know what's interesting? Some analysts are actually saying this massive sell-off might, and this is kind of counterintuitive, actually be a good thing in the long run. Because once all these early miners finish selling, right, the price might actually stabilize and start climbing again.
Speaking of exchanges, can we talk about where Pi is actually being traded right now? Because I've heard there's some interesting developments there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, and this is really fascinating. Pi has managed to get listed on some pretty significant exchanges, right? Like OKX, Gate.io, and CoinDCX. And this is a huge, but there's this really interesting situation with Binance.
What's the story there? Why isn't it on Binance yet?
Well, you see, Binance is like, the absolute giant in the crypto world, right? And they're being really, really cautious about Pi. They actually posted something on X recently, like asking their followers what they think about Pi Network, which is interesting. And this is where things get really spicy. We've got this whole controversy with Bybit's CEO.
Oh, what happened there?
So Benju, right, the CEO of Bybit, he just came out and this is pretty shocking, straight up called Pi a scam. Like he wasn't subtle about it at all. He actually said, and I remember this exactly, Bybit will not list scams. And get this, he revealed that he'd been invited to join Pi Network earlier, but turned them down because he thought it was, in his words, ridiculous.
That's a pretty strong stance to take. Did he explain his reasoning?
Oh yeah, he did. And this is really interesting. He actually drew from his experience in Forex trading, right, saying he'd seen similar patterns before where people struggled to get their money back. And he was really clear about wanting to avoid bringing those kinds of issues into the crypto space.
That sounds pretty concerning for potential investors.
Absolutely. And you know what's really crucial here? This whole situation with Bybit and the missing Binance listing, right? It's creating this kind of credibility gap that Pi Network really needs to address. Because, and this is super important, having major exchange support isn't just about trading volume, it's about legitimacy in the crypto world.
So with all these ups and downs we've been discussing, what's the actual outlook for Pi? Like, what are the experts saying about its future?
Oh, this is actually really fascinating, Because despite everything we've talked about, there are some analysts who are, and this might surprise you, really optimistic about Pi's potential. Like, Fortune India actually came out with this really, really interesting prediction that Pi could, and I mean, this is pretty wild, potentially hit $500 by 2030.
Wow, that's quite a jump from where it is now. What needs to happen for that kind of growth?
So, and this is really crucial, it all comes down to two main things, right? First, Pi Network absolutely needs to nail this mainstream adoption thing, right? Like, they need to get real people using it for real things. And secondly, which is just as important, they need to build out these practical, everyday use cases.
What kind of use cases are we talking about?
Well, you see, it's all about getting businesses to actually accept Pi as payment, right? Like, imagine going to your local coffee shop and paying with Pi or using it for online shopping. The thing is, Pi needs to transform from this thing people just mine on their phones into something that's actually useful in the real world. You know what I mean?
But with its current challenges, does that seem realistic?
So here's the really interesting thing. Pi has this massive advantage with its huge user base, right? Like, we're talking about over 110 million installations, and that's absolutely incredible. But, and this is super important, they need to convert these miners into actual active users who are, making transactions, building applications, creating this whole ecosystem.
After everything we've discussed today, what's your final take on Pi Network? Like, should crypto enthusiasts be worried or excited?
That's such an interesting question, and I think, well, it's really a bit of both, right? Like, we've got this absolutely fascinating project that's doing something really unique with mobile mining, and the massive user base is just incredible. But you know what I mean? There are definitely these serious challenges they need to overcome.
And what would you say to people who are currently mining Pi on their phones?
So I think the most important thing is to be, you know, realistic about expectations. Like, yes, there's this amazing potential and the technology is really interesting, but don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? The thing is, Pi needs time to prove itself, to build out its ecosystem, and to really show what it can do in the real world.
Well, that's all we have time for today on Decoding Crypto Pi. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Pi Network story.
And remember, everyone, the crypto world is constantly evolving, and Pi Network is just one fascinating piece of this incredible puzzle. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.